Welcome to the Workology Podcast, a podcast for the disruptive workplace leader. Join host Jessica Miller-Merrill, founder of Workology.com, as she sits down and gets to the bottom of trends, tools, and case studies for the business leader, HR, and recruiting professional who is tired of the status quo. Now here's Jessica with this episode of Workology.
Welcome to the Workology Podcast, sponsored by Clear Company. If there's one thing I've learned in my many years as writer and speaker in HR is that there is power in personal stories, which is what you're about to hear. Age discrimination is a topic that is hidden away behind closed doors, but the simple fact is we're not getting any younger. According to the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, or BLS, about 40% of people aged 55 and older were working or actively looking for work in 2014. That number, known as the labor force participation rate, is expected to increase fastest for the older segments of the population, most notably people aged 65 to 74 and 75 and older throughout 2024. In contrast, participation rates for most other age groups in the labor force aren't projected to change as much between 2014 and 2024. Our aging workforce is growing, but our economy is strong, and yet so many people are experiencing the struggle to be able to find a job over 40. Today I'm joined by Jo Weech. She's the founder of Exemplary Consultants. Jo, welcome to the Workology Podcast.
Thanks.
Can you talk a little bit about your background? Give people an idea of where you've been and what you do now.
Okay, so I got my start in research, marketing, and recruitment back in 2002. I was working with 100 marketing intern slots twice a year. And so what was fun is that over 7 years, I got to develop return interns with leadership training and then gave them responsibility for teams of interns. Being able to then create HR processes led to positions wherein I got to jump into the deep end of the pool into all things HR, talent acquisition, social recruitment marketing, data analytics, and the like. So I started consulting in all of those areas in 2012 when a friend asked me to start my own company so that they could pay me for my advice.
That's a good thing.
Always.
Well, so today's topic is all about the subject of age discrimination, which I think is sort of the workplace elephant in the room. You recently wrote an article on LinkedIn that has been on fire about age discrimination. Can you talk a little bit about the article and why you think it really hit home?
Sure. I got to spend the last 15 months working both sides of the recruitment table, and being a candidate for senior roles was unlike anything I had anticipated. I started tracking the plethora of illegal statements made to me, along with a collection of buzzwords and phrases that I came to interpret as skirting the legalities of discrimination. So I'm a woman, I'm biracial, and I'm now over 40. So the first two categories of EEOC are thankfully not so much an issue in today's marketplace, thanks to extraordinary work that's been done on reducing gender and race discrimination. But I had no idea really that ageism was a thing, despite having people over 40 tell me this again and again in career transition groups that I have served over the past 10 years. One gentleman gave his story at one of these meetups that he had a full head of hair, but it was all gray. He had fantastic phone interviews, but never got past the face-to-face interviews. He then dyed his hair blonde. The very next role that he had a face interview with, he was hired. And unfortunately, that is not an uncommon story. I think this hit home for people on 6 continents. And it's because I didn't just write a research paper that quotes studies and surveys that were done. This is my personal story. It is real. It has happened and continues to happen to me and apparently thousands of people all over the world. So when Susan Fowler, the Uber engineer, shared her story about sexual harassment that happened to her personally, I believe that resonated with people, and I think they found courage to find their own voices, and people attribute that to the start of the Me Too movement. And I do believe it's because she didn't just write an article about sexism or sexual harassment, but she just shared her personal story. So I think that's what has resonated.
Well, I appreciate you taking the time to share your story because it is happening. It is out there. And you have more than over almost 10,000 comments or thumbs up on the article that's on LinkedIn. So it has definitely struck a chord with a large group of people. Let's talk a little bit more about this. Why is this an issue? I'm over 40, and I think a lot of our podcast listeners are over 40 as well, or approaching that number. We all likely will be. Why is it such a problem?
Okay, so I think I've formulated a few beliefs about why this is an issue in the workplace. When you look at the fact that right behind baby boomers are Gen X and Y, and soon to be Z, that are starting companies or being propelled into leadership positions, with really some good business sense, or they have good product knowledge, but they don't really have life experience. It's like someone who's never had children who writes about books on parenting. They are evaluating issues without a context. For example, a CFO might see the bottom line and decide to replace senior, more highly paid personnel with younger, less expensive persons. And it used to be, back when pensions were given by companies, that a tactic used was to eliminate a person's position before they could qualify for that pension. So this is more of like a bottom line, but it's not taking into consideration the domino ramifications. And so instead of providing coaching and equipping for more mature workers, such as tutorials on leveraging today's social media with cool tools, or courses in agile methodology, or, providing, even little webinars on how to use GIFs in Slack, for example, it's just easier to eliminate their position and fill it with someone who grew up with those tools and technologies. So I encountered one young company whose makeup was 92% under the age of 20, including the owners. And I was told that their company policy was not to hire anyone for whom they could not provide a career path. This means that they would never be able to benefit from the wisdom and experience of someone who didn't need or want one, and who could inform them what their fresh idea was implemented in previous years with some major drawbacks. So why keep reinventing the wheel 5 different ways without someone there to say why 3 of them have been epic fails in previous years for the same reasons that are still in existence today? So I think that really it's just about not being cognizant of what the ROI is for having seasoned people, not necessarily seasoned experience, but just even people who are seasoned with life. And I also think that additionally, as a human race, and especially here in America, we have lost respect for our elders, for the elderly, and instead of caring for them, we ship them off to nursing homes. So it's only a matter of time before they are sent off to be released, as Lois Lowry wrote about in the book The Giver. Youth has always been celebrated, but not to the extreme that it is today, and youth has been elevated in such a way as to be emulated, adulated, and hence billions of dollars being spent to look and feel young. So what's going to happen in 10 years when all of these people are going to be over 40? They're going to be experiencing what we're experiencing, but they didn't plan for it today. So I think that this would, for me, be what the main issues are that I'm seeing.
It's interesting that you mentioned the interview because it's been a few years, but I have interviewed for jobs at various places over the years. I, like you, have been self-employed consultant, doing various projects and working with different clients. And I walked in, it's a very popular Silicon Valley company in HR tech, and it was not my jam at all. It was everyone probably under the age of 24. And it was clear that the maturity level of the organization was not a place that I wanted to be a part of, or the culture. And then I read some articles about that company later on, and I certainly made the right decision not to move forward with the organization and the position. So I think it's a problem. I mean, if you come in as a senior leader, like a VP of HR role, you don't necessarily have a career path to COO or CEO. And I think that and maybe sounds like you're okay with that. Like you're not naive.
And sometimes we don't necessarily want that. I got the privilege of working in one company where, I'm not making this up, I was old enough to be every single person's mother. And what I found, though, was that as I would hang out with them during board game night, doing Settlers of Catan, and doing those different things like staying up until midnight to get into the first showing of that newest Star Wars release or whatever, that as I just mingled among them, they considered me one of them. But the distinction was that when one of the persons had a problem come up on a weekend, I was the person that they called to help. And one of the owners was really disappointed, saying, well, why didn't he call me? I'm the one who, I'm his team lead. I got him into the company. I said, yes, but at the end of the day, you're still an owner of the company. And I said, I just really feel great that, that he felt comfortable enough, to holler at me, knowing that I wouldn't see it as any big deal, help him out with the problem. And we got, it took all day, but we got it taken care of. And so I think that sometimes people don't realize that, yes, we do represent their parents, which they want to rebel against. But then again, at the end of the day, once they get a little bit more maturity, they know that those are the people that they want to go for advice and help.
Well, I am seeing more litigation on the subject of age discrimination, and everyone's getting older. That is just a fact of life, as you've mentioned. And in your article, you mentioned the IBM lawsuit, which we're including in the resources section of the podcast transcript there. There's also been a lawsuit that's been in the courts for a while with PwC, and older workers filed a lawsuit against the company because of their college recruiting practices. So recently, a judge has decided, this is actually last week, decided that they were throwing out the case, that they weren't considering it age discrimination. But while I know your article talks a lot about being over 40 and interviewing, I'm seeing more of the trend of these things happening, but how can employers get ahead of this? What can they do?
Okay, so let me first propose that although the EEOC makes it illegal to discriminate against a wide variety of demographics, the reality is that this does not erase internal biases, and especially of business owners, as I mentioned in my article. It has to be top-down. Business owners, CEOs, hiring managers. They need to make it clear that company-wide, not only does recruiting need to cast a very wide net to make their efforts all-inclusive, every team member needs to be exposed to and provided opportunities to engage with people from diverse backgrounds, but also who are diverse in thought. Look at the way that people are engaging in political discussions on social media. Horrendous name-calling, denigrating of a differing opinion, and this is even coming from the person with the position of leading our country. At some point down the line, we need to just say no to disrespect of any person for any reason. So why do we need positions like Director of Diversity and Inclusion? Well, for one thing, I think this says so much about our recruiting processes. So the ways to fix this are to, follow all the 6 suggestions in my article, and then to get the owners and leaders to require inclusion at all levels of the company, but particularly with recruitment. I want to see benchmarks of diverse outreach, not how many emails you sent out, which converted to how many calls made, etc. I believe that recruiting can stop all discrimination with inclusive outreach, but only if it's mandated from the top down. And then in reference to the PwC case about making sure that we're not discriminating against older workers, and college recruiting isn't something that discriminates against older workers unless that's the only massive outreach that you're doing. I'm all for college recruiting. I engage in it, and I've done workshops on it. However, that can't be the only mass effort, for recruiting new employees. So as I had mentioned at the beginning of my article, I volunteered at a 50-plus job fair, and the companies represented were such an insult to the hundreds of attendees whose stellar backgrounds and careers would lend phenomenal input into the myriad of companies. I think I reviewed nearly 30 resumes during that time, and each one had an unacceptable reason that they were told they were let go. Now, it could have been for other reasons, but our litigious society prevents companies from being truthful. If they were let go because the company didn't coach them along the way to update their skill sets and technologies, I think that is a travesty. So if a company has mature workers, career pathing may not be more promotions, but simply updating and making more relevant the ways they do their work. This way that gives the employee equal opportunity to continue to make valuable contributions. Then no one becomes outdated or irrelevant.
I love these suggestions, and I think that it can start small too. You mentioned just having a class on GIFs or GIFs, and it could just be a little lunch and learn that's 15 minutes that's held or posted online so people can get the information they need and feel more confident and comfortable in communicating and working with their peers, regardless of their age or background.
Exactly.
Well, I mentioned this earlier about the PwC case, and I will have links to all this stuff on the transcripts. And the judge did decide that the college recruiting wasn't discrimination. PwC does a lot of hiring and recruiting outside of just college and universities. What are some ways that we can maybe work with our executives to help them move this needle? Because I think that it involves maybe some frank conversations with our leaders that says, this is happening, it needs to stop, here's what you need to do.
I think that those conversations really, if you think about it, the reason why we have practices that are illegal today, I can't tell you the number of direct messages I've gotten from recruiters saying that different hiring managers or people in staffing agencies say their clients are asking them, to look for, to target people in a certain age range. And so if you're working for the company, I think it's okay to push back and say, what you're asking me to do is illegal. But then how companies get around that is they hire outside staffing firms. And then so they're not directly discriminating, but they're asking, the staffing agency, to look for that. So I think that staffing agencies need to push back on that as well. So until we get pushback where people are just saying, no, I'm not going to do that because it's discrimination and that's illegal, and unfortunately, people that are on the lower pecking end are the ones that are afraid of losing their jobs. But unless someone says no, to persons, they're not going to initiate conversations like, oh, how can we be a more diverse culture? How can we be more inclusive? These are not the conversations they're thinking about having. And so coming in to try to force the conversation when they don't have a pain point for it, I don't think it's going to fall on receptive ears. So I think that it almost has to be where the pushback comes from, the trenches, and just says, no, we're not going to do it that way.
I like that.
And because it's illegal.
And I really hope that some staffing companies or some folks from staffing firms are listening, because you are responsible for the hiring and the success of an organization and certainly their diversity. It would be interesting to do some research of the type of hires from your staffing partners to see the types of candidates that are coming through and then hold them accountable to certain metrics and expectations for diversity as well. Let's take a reset. This is Jessica Miller-Merrill, and you're listening to the Workology podcast, sponsored by Clear Company. We're talking about the workplace elephant in the room, age discrimination. Today we're talking with Joe Weech. You can follow Joe on Twitter at Joe Weech. It's at JOWEECH.
This podcast is sponsored by Clear Company. Clear Company is the world's fastest growing talent management platform, allowing companies to easily hire, retain, and engage more A-players. Visit clearcompany.com to sign up for a free demo.
We've talked a little bit about employers, Joe, and things that need to change, but what about job seekers? You talked a little bit about the gentleman who changed his hair color and suddenly he had a job interview, a face-to-face, and got the job offer. But what are some things that job seekers can do maybe to be more successful at interviewing? Do you think everybody should run out and dye their hair and get Botox, or should we push back?
Well, thank you so much for this question, because for the past 10 years, as I mentioned, I've worked with thousands of job seekers really in the over 40 category. I speak at job fairs for transitioning military, retiring State Department personnel, at local meetups where the attendees are largely in this category. So I actually wrote an article as a follow-up to this article based on again, hundreds upon hundreds of requests that came in to me of people saying, well, what can we do? It's like, yes, this is a problem, but what can we do about it? How can we overcome this? So the article it's called Job Search Tips for Job Seekers Over 40. And so a couple of the suggestions were on this article, like, decide what you want to be when you grow up. And so at the risk of sounding just utterly arrogant and rude, let me explain what I mean by that. When you get to be over 40, and especially over 50, you may have worked in different industries. You may have done different things. And people feel like they need to include every single thing they have ever done in every company since they started their lawn mowing business in high school. But from my standpoint as a recruiter, when I'm looking at a resume, I have a hard time figuring out, what it is that they are looking to do. Do they want to do accounting or do they want to do landscaping? It's just one of those situations where if you're going to get 6 seconds to attract a recruiter's attention, you need to give them something that really applies to just their requisition. So I wouldn't go back to anything that you did all the way to the 1960s. Just take the last 10 to 15 years and just highlight the things that you have done that are commensurate with the role you're applying for, because we don't need to know all the extraneous other duties you had if it has nothing to do with, the responsibilities in the role. And I've had people say, but yes, it shows what, how diverse I can be and what a, great background I had. I said, well, save some of those stories for the interview, but, for your profile, for your resume, it really needs to be, centric. It needs to just reflect one role that you're going after. And let's say you go after that role and it's not working out and you want to do one of your other types of roles, then just reset all of your LinkedIn profile, keep all the different companies in there, but then highlight the things that you did that are commensurate with that different path. So that's a very important thing to do. And then I would say that I'm going to skip down to like the last one, and that's never, never, never give up. I have actually had to talk two people away from a ledge, because when people aren't gainfully employed, it's like their value and worth as a human being is tied into what contribution they can make to this society. And this just breaks my heart. So I will just say to not give up. You just need to wake up every morning, think about the things for which you have to be grateful. And when you go to bed at night, don't meditate on everything that went wrong, the rejection notices you got or whatever. You need to just think about, 3 things that went right. And I know it sounds really stupid to be highlighting, mind over matter, but really if you don't change the way that you think, when I can't tell you the number of people I've interviewed where their negativity just oozes from their pores. You can hear it in their voices. You can see it in their faces when they show up for face interviews. And I think that will serve to not help you in your job search process, but it will actually repel people, and they may not even be able to put their finger on it. So I can't stress enough how much you really just need to remain positive, and that's on you. It's not about your circumstances. It's about how you are going to either react or respond to your circumstance. So I say just say no to negative thoughts.
I love that. Highlight your skills that are specific to the job. Don't try to tell the whole story. Just be really targeted in your experience, and then never give up, because it only takes one yes, right, to make it happen. And I will say that when you are having a hard time, or you're down in your luck, or you're having a bad day, that does come through in conversations and in your interview. So that positive self-talk, I do it all the time, super important and a great way to help you mentally prepare for those interview conversations. Well, Joe, I have appreciated you having you on the show. I do want to talk a little bit about another article in which you didn't author, but you were quoted in on candidate ghosting. So it was a LinkedIn article that came on, I guess, about a month before your most recent post. But what I was surprised from this article was the questions, comments, and emails that you've been receiving, which it's same with the last one. You've gotten hundreds of messages and and comments and conversations. Can you talk about what that's been like to literally have thousands of emails and LinkedIn requests in your mailbox, and what's changed you personally, some of those messages?
Well, I can tell you that I really have been dramatically affected by each and every correspondence, and I have done my best to respond. It's very difficult on LinkedIn to respond to actual specific comments because you can't just actually, when you get notified that someone made a comment, for whatever reason, when you click on it, it doesn't take you to where that comment is. So you have to scroll through the hundreds of other comments to try to find where that comment was because you know you have something you want to respond to. But I kind of spent the weekend trying to do that. But I will say that there are two things that I have found profound in all of the different stories, and that's that, number one, as recruiters, we are doing a sucky job at treating people with respect. The fact that most people are like, I don't know if you saw that there were over 4,000, 5,000 comments about that article that Chip Cutter wrote about, those of us who are in recruitment being ghosted by candidates, and everybody was like, you're getting what you deserve. Karma's a bitch. You're complaining that it's happening to you while you started it first. And I mean, it was just incredible. But what I saw were pain points. And I feel that every single person had a legitimate pain point. I found that in my own personal experience, I'd actually gone through 3 face interviews and been completely ghosted by a company. And that's after presenting my plan for my first 90 days of what I would accomplish, in the world that they had asked me to provide. And after that, I did not hear anything back from that company. And I think that this is one thing that recruiters everywhere can change up. I don't care how busy we are. We need to just get the people who are supervising our work to understand that unless we are providing people not just with a good experience, we hear candidate experience all the time, but I envision doing a vaudeville, show, and they were doing some sort of a song and dance to try to entertain people. So to me, it's not about the experience. It's about how are we engaging people? Are we treating them the way we want to be treated? Are we treating them as though they are our customers? And I think that Virgin Airways had that whole hullabaloo where they started losing ridership from people that had bad experiences, as candidates. So they learned that if you treat your candidates like you want to treat your customers because they are your customers, you're going to have a different outcome. So I think that from that standpoint, and even though I have done everything in my professional career as a recruiter to never ghost a person, it doesn't mean it didn't happen. I'm just not aware of it happening because I've been very ruthless in making sure of this. That's why I joined the Association of Talent Acquisition Professionals, because I want to up the standards for recruitment so that we can all abide by if for no other reason, by common courtesy. So I think that that's important. And so it really helped me to rethink challenging recruiters everywhere. I was just speaking at RecFest, which had about 1,500 recruiters in London. And I brought this up because it had just happened. And I was really encouraging everyone to never do this. And then the second thing that really shocked me most recently with this article is how many people, seriously, from 6 different continents, there could have been someone from Antarctica, but I didn't notice, but 6 other continents, that really talk about they are in deep despair. And so I'm thinking, what society does this to people? When these mature workers are unable to support themselves, they can become homeless, commit crimes, be institutionalized, succumb to more diseases because stress impacts the immune system. So you know what this is going to eventually be? It's going to become more of a massive burden on society. And this looks to me like it's paving a road to euthanasia, which is a very sordid solution, but it's because we're not addressing this now. And it's not, I just really feel like we need to provide meaningful work to mature workers. Not that greeter at Walmart isn't meaningful work, but I don't think that's going to cut it for so many of the people that I have heard from. So I think that if we can continue to engage, people at every different stage of their career and keep them employed with meaningful work, then the society as a whole will benefit. And then the diversity of thought will also stimulate better solutions in any organization.
Well, Joe, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us today. You've enlightened me, you've got me thinking, and I don't want to speak for everyone here, but I definitely think that hopefully you're inspiring some recruiters to maybe do a little bit of self-reflection and think about the conversations that they've had with job seekers and maybe ways that they can help those, don't have to be over 40, but anyone and everyone. Where can people go to connect with you and learn more about what you do?
Well, believe it or not, out of over 500 million profiles on LinkedIn, I'm the only Joe Weech. It's just J-O, Weech, W-E-E-C-H, and so it's really the easiest way to connect with me there.
We will link to Joe's LinkedIn profile in the transcript of the podcast as well, but I want to thank you again for taking the time to talk with us today.
Well, I really appreciate your having me and our being able to talk about, this what seems like the final frontier in, blatantly practiced discrimination.
So many people are over 40, and that number is only going to increase. So I think it's good for us to have this conversation. And I appreciate you shining a spotlight on it with the podcast and then all your work on LinkedIn.
Thanks so much, Jessica.
Are you stuck maintaining your HRCI and SHRM certifications? Learn by Workology is an on-demand learning system making recertification simple. Visit workology.com/learn or text Workology to 55678 to learn more. Text 55678 to Workology. Now, back to the podcast.
I love Joe's willingness to share her own personal story, igniting conversation about ageism and discrimination. It's up to us to speak up and drive inclusion in our workplaces. I love Joe's suggestion to measure diversity outreach and hiring metrics instead of simply just focusing on the number of calls, the number of in-mails when looking at recruiting metrics. We're not getting any younger, and it's up to us to push back, drive conversations, and educate our business leaders on the value that workplace inclusion brings. Thank you for joining the Workology podcast, sponsored by Clear Company. This podcast is for the disruptive workplace leader who's tired of the status quo. This is Jessica Miller Merrill. Until next time, you can visit workology.com to listen to all our previous podcast episodes.
Production services for the Workology podcast with Jessica Miller Merrill provided by TotalPicture.com.